America is a country founded on the ideal of expansion and manifest destiny. Although we've had time periods where our foreign policy is isolationist, most of our history is marked by intervention in other countries' domestic affairs. Often, we use democracy as an excuse to intervene in other countries for economic reasons. This can be seen most recently in the war in Iraq. The war began in 2003 when United States troops invaded and toppled Saddam Hussein's government. Hussein was the dictator of Iraq and threatened U.S. interests in oil. President Bush hoped that invading and establishing a government more friendly to U.S. interests would spur similar uprisings in other oil countries. Reasons given to the American public for the invasion included to free the people of Iraq, and it was believed that the government was harboring weapons of mass destruction, although none were ever found. Action taken by Bush to invade was condemned by many U.S. allies as anti-Arab imperialism and left Iraq in descending chaos for years to come. However, this wasn't the only time when U.S. intervention in other countries was economically motivated. The ideal of U.S. intervention and the defining of foreign policy can be traced back to 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine. Written by President James Monroe, it effectively ended America's isolationist policies and said that the United States had a right to the Caribbean. Any efforts by Europe to colonize there would be resisted. This continued with manifest destiny, the idea that it was the United States' God-given right to expand west. These ideas governed much of our foreign policy and intervention in other nations throughout history. As early as 1875, the U.S. was intervening in other countries for economic reasons. This was seen in Hawaii. In 1875, King Kalakaua signed a treaty giving the U.S. access to Hawaiian sugar cane markets, a huge investment for U.S. companies. In 1887, a new constitution was signed giving the U.S. access to Pearl Harbor as a refueling point for U.S. Navy ships. However, his successor, Queen Liliuokalani, refused to recognize the new constitution and was less friendly to U.S. interests. In 1893, Sanford B. Dole, with the help of the U.S. government, staged a coup and deposed the Queen, establishing a democracy that favored his and other companies' interests. In 1898, Hawaii was formally annexed by the United States. The U.S. intervention in Hawaii was economically motivated by the sugarcane market and access to Pearl Harbor. This continued with U.S. intervention in Colombia, motivated by the Panama Canal. In 1880, France started building a canal through Panama as a cheap trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific. However, widespread disease and death of workers caused the project to go bankrupt. In 1902, the United States purchased building rights and French assets and attempted to negotiate a treaty with the Colombian president. The treaty was rejected by Colombian Congress, and the U.S., under President Theodore Roosevelt, responded by dispatching U.S. warships to Panama to aid in a Panamanian revolution, and in 1903, Panama declared independence. The newly established democracy, in return, gave U.S. rights to the Panama Canal, which, although seen as a huge foreign policy victory at the time, poisoned U.S. and Panamanian relations in the future. U.S. intervention to gain Panama's independence was not so much motivated by their desire to free Panama, but more so motivated by economic reasons. In 1954, Guatemala democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was a socialist who proposed widespread reform to end poverty in Guatemala, where 2% of the population owned 72% of the land. He proposed taking away land from U.S. companies and giving that land to the dispossessed poor. The United Fruit Company, who owned much of this land, lobbied the government to intervene on the grounds that Arbenz was a communist leader who posed a great threat, even though he was democratically elected. Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, were sympathetic to the United Fruit Company as they had done legal work for them prior to their roles in the Eisenhower administration. The CIA staged a coup in Guatemala, ousting Arbenz and establishing a president more friendly to U.S. and UFC interests. The U.S. intervention in Guatemala was economically motivated. It is important to recognize the pattern of American intervention in other countries' domestic affairs throughout history, which have been economically motivated, because it is important to recognize those patterns in present day. This is evident in Iraq, but also so many other countries. And historically, we have seen that these countries, contrary to claims from Washington, were not the better off for this intervention. We must recognize this, and U.S. intervention in other countries' domestic affairs has damaged so many countries, and recognition and repairs must be made.